Hello and welcome to the garden. Well, it has been a glorious morning here. Beautiful spring day. It's just starting to cloud over now. Weather looks like it might be a bit moody this afternoon, but this morning's been wonderful. And in the greenhouse here, it's really quite warm. And the peach blossom is just coming out. And I've just gone through with the old soft paintbrush here and given these a little bit of a tickle. Hopefully we'll get some peaches later. Little bit concerned about the cold weather that's on the horizon, but hopefully undercover here these blossoms will be okay. And actually this morning has been fantastic for the pollinating. Done late morning or early afternoon on a day like today, there is a ton of pollen. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but let's try this. It's yellow with pollen, thick with it. It's just wonderful. This is a great day to come in and do the pollinating. And it's just luck that I happen to be here when there's a great day for it. If you've got a series of really dull, overcast, cool days, it's not nearly as much pollen around to shift, but this one looks pretty good. Quite a lot of the blossom is out, but I don't know, maybe a third of it. On some branches, maybe as much as half, but I still need a few more good days over the next week or so to get this lot nicely covered. With a bit of luck, we'll get those. But anyway, what I wanted to mention today was something that I've talked about on quite a few of my pruning videos when I've worked on the peaches, on the apricot, and on various other fruits. I've talked about the difference between vigorous and productive wood. So you would be forgiven for imagining that a good, strong, vigorous shoot is going to be productive in terms of fruit. But in the majority of cases, it's the exact opposite. So very often when I've gone round and I've done the pruning, and I know I mentioned it when I did the apricot pruning, that I cut out the most vigorous wood and I kept the much weaker side branches because they will be much more productive. So, I mean, there's two things that very often they're related. So the most vigorous branches tend to be the vertical ones. So this one here, it's a strong branch, and that's largely because it's growing straight up. It's taking a lot of the sap and it wants to just keep growing up and up. And these branches, they're not thinking about producing fruit. They're thinking about growing. Whereas some of these others that are more horizontal, they're a lot less vigorous because they're laid down. And always when you're laying a branch down, you're going to get much more fruit from those branches. And of course, they're a lot less vigorous. They're a lot thinner. Now, on a peach tree like this, some of the wood will be part of the permanent framework, and the rest of it, like these branches, will be grown fresh each year because this peach is only going to fruit on this 1-year-old wood. So all of this wood that's in flower here was grown last year. And because this space isn't huge, I mean, it's a good sized space, but for a peach tree, it's not that big. And because this space isn't huge, my framework, my permanent framework is right down here. There's not a lot of it. And I grow all of these branches fresh each year to provide this fruiting wood. But at this time of year, when you can start to see exactly where the blossom is, it really does show up how the more vertical growth, the more vigorous growth is so much less productive than those branches that are laid down and that are more weakly growing. And it doesn't matter what tree it is, particularly with things that you're fan training, get those branches laid down. But it makes a difference even when I'm pruning, say, the cordon apples and pears, and if there's something coming off of one of those branches and it's in a vertical orientation, it's not great. I'd much rather prune those out and take some side shoots off, get some horizontal growth, something that's off of the vertical, because that vigorous wood, it doesn't help at all. It's just not that fruitful. If you've got a freestanding tree, and this is brilliant with plums, I love a festoon. So you take those whippy young branches that are growing up, typically quite vertical with some of the plums, and you bend them down in graceful arches, and it looks beautiful when it's all been done like that. But also as you bend those branches down quite a bit, actually, you can tie them to stakes or something in the ground. I've seen it where they've had a metal ring in the ground, and that lets you tie branches down, or when they're very young and whippy, you can clip weights on them, and that will tug the end down, and then you get that curved branch. That will break out in flower all along the length of that branch and be immensely productive. In fact, a festoon plum can be so productive that later in the season you need to bang some stakes in to support those branches, or you'll get quite a lot of breakages. But anytime you've got the opportunity to choose between two branches, one being quite vertical and vigorous and the other one being weaker and probably not so vertical, my advice would always be to choose the latter. You know, as long as they're both healthy and everything else is fine. Vertical growth, in terms of productivity, it's not our friend. So it's a good idea to minimize the amount of vertical growth. It's very easy on a fan as you're going through this part of the fan. The branches are all laid down, they're all pretty good. When you start filling in the middle, you very often end up with what I've ended up with here, and that is some unproductive vertical growth. And I will get a pretty poor crop from these this year in this position. Hopefully I can do something with the young shoots that are coming up now in order to pick some weaker growth from these. Very often I would cut these vertical pieces out, but I may retain a few of these and see what I can train off at angles from the sides so that I don't have this vertical growth next year. But I just thought while they're in blossom, I can actually show you why I'm cutting out vertical wood and picking the weak stuff. And let's take a closer look at a few of these branches. So this is the most vigorous piece of wood on the tree this year, and there are a couple of blossoms here, not well placed. I mean, that one's no good, really. You can't develop the fruit there. This one would be great if it sets, but there's not a lot else. There's long sections of this that are quite bare. Some of the side shoots off of this, I mean, this is a pretty vigorous side shoot, actually, and there are flowers on it, but even these side shoots, they're not the best, not by a long shot. This piece at the back here, this is also vertical, and similarly, there's very little on this branch of any use. That side shoot there, though, is very weak, and as you can see, it is covered in blossom, and that's a lovely piece of fruiting wood. But it's when we get down to these branches that are almost horizontal that we find just an abundance of flower, and you can see almost every position along these branches is loaded with very nice blossom, and a lot of these are well placed, so these here would be great to carry the crop. Now I only want a couple of fruits in each place, because you can't bring that many to perfect maturity, and the tree will drop some and I will thin some. But even so, I mean, this is the sort of wood I really like to see. It's I mean, this is hanging down, but horizontal wood is immensely productive. Even the vertical shoots coming off of this branch are actually pretty productive. That's because this branch itself is quite weak growing, and as a consequence, even this vertical growth here isn't overly vigorous. And again, this one is covered. If we look at this piece here, this is actually quite a vigorous piece of wood. I mean, it's all relative, but all of this was grown last season, but this has some blossom on it, but it's not covered like these thin whippy pieces. So this isn't bad, and it's possible that we'll get some fruit in one or two of those positions. But again, here's a thinner, less vigorous, more horizontal piece of wood, and it is covered in, well, fat buds and a couple of open flowers. And that's the sort of wood that we need to produce here to have a good crop. Well, the situation is very similar on the neighbouring tree. This is quite a vigorous branch. Again, all of this is 1-year-old wood, and there's very little. We've got one there, we've got one here, we've got a little cluster there, and we've probably got a blossom here, but it's no good, it's not well placed. This piece of timber is not good, but this one that's coming off of it, there are a lot more flowers on it. And then this less vigorous piece of wood here, and compared with this one, it's very much less vigorous, and it's got a ton of blossom on here. This particular variety is, the flowers are, it looks like they're a little bit stunted. They're much smaller, they're much more colourful, but that's just a characteristic of this particular variety. And again, the weaker wood down here, covered in flowers. The more vigorous piece, very little on them. So that's it really. I just thought I'd take the opportunity to illustrate what I meant on previous videos, because very often when you're pruning, you can't see that. I mean, the flower's long gone, the crop's long gone, and you're doing the pruning. But it is important to bear in mind that vigorous wood, it might look like a good idea to keep that strong growth, but unless you're trying to produce a large tree and fill a large space, that vigorous wood is not what you want. And if you've got a tree that's already filling out the area you want to keep it in, then vigorous vertical growth is really not what you want. So when I pruned this apricot in particular, I talked about the vigorous wood because there was some crazy growth on that. And again, it happened in just 1 year, but you can get great big thick branches on these trees when you're trying to keep them in a small space. They've got a decent root system on them. You can get enormous amounts of growth, and it's very easy to have a couple of vertical branches kick off, and they need to be dealt with. So it might have looked really weird when I was pruning this, because I was cutting out great big thick branches and keeping this weedy looking stuff that you would think perhaps wasn't the right way to go. I mean, I'll show you the branches I was cutting out. So this large branch here, this was produced last season, and it's amazing just how much growth they will put on. And these little side shoots though are the ones that I've kept. So I've cut that branch out. This went on up and up and up, and broke out further up the greenhouse, and I've cut all of that away because this will never produce fruit. It's absolutely useless as fruiting wood. But this whippy young stuff, I've got to tie this one down, but this whippy young growth here, that has the potential to be much more productive. So that's it for this video. I just wanted to illustrate that point because I think it's an important one, and it's one that's not so often talked about in pruning videos or in pruning books. And it's something that I will apply throughout the garden here, and I've got fan trained plums and sour cherries around the fence. I will be bearing that very much in mind as I prune those, trying to control that vigorous vertical growth. And indeed, if you're trying to tame a tree that is a bit more vigorous than the space allows, getting rid of that vertical growth, bending a branch down, those are great ways of sort of taming that vigor, because that branch, as you bend it down, it's not going to grow nearly as much as if it's pointing skywards. I mean, they're all trying to compete to become the new leader, and some trees have a really vertical growth naturally. The cherry trees are one of the worst. Their growth can be strongly vertical. There are some other fruits and also some varieties that have more of a spreading habit, and they're a bit easier to tame. But anyway, that's all for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.